It was October 1966. The A Shao Valley. The time was 0400 hours, a moment before the jungle's nocturnal symphony gave way to the oppressive heat of the day. From a ridge concealed by a triple canopy of teak and mahogany, a man named Nguyen Van Truong watched the American camp. He was not a soldier in the conventional sense. He was a cadre, a political officer for the Vietcong, and his war was one of ideas as much as bullets. The camp below was a raw, red earth, sword carved into the green flesh of the valley. It was designated Special Forces Operational Base, A-101. To Truong, it was an absurdity. It was a monument to American weakness. He watched the perimeter lights, powered by a constantly thrumming generator, pushing back the darkness with a brute force arrogance. His own men moved through that same darkness like water, their senses honed by a lifetime of scarcity. They did not need to conquer the night. They were a part of it. He saw the careless stacks of sandbags, the concertina wire laid out in geometric patterns, the empty C-ration cans glinting in the spill of the lights. Waste. Everything about the Americans screamed of waste. They burned their refuse in stinking pits, a stench of excess that clung to the humid air. His people would have found a use for every scrap of metal, every shred of cardboard. Truong's superiors in Hanoi had assured them of the righteousness and inevitable victory of their cause. The Americans, they were told, were a paper tiger. They were mercenaries, soft capitalists accustomed to comfort, unwilling to endure the hardship that was the Vietnamese birthright. They possessed technology, yes, but the Vietnamese possessed will. They had machines, but the Vietnamese had spirit. In the long calculus of a people's war, spirit would always outlast steel. He believed it. He had seen it. He had seen his comrades endure wounds that would have sent an American screaming for a helicopter. He had subsisted for weeks on a handful of rice and the jungle's bitter bounty. He had memorized the writings of Ho Chi Minh and General Giap. Their logic was irrefutable. The material strength of the enemy was a liability, a dependency that could be severed. The revolutionary strength was internal, unbreakable. A new sound began to intrude, a low drone from the east. It grew into the familiar, throbbing beat of a helicopter. A medical evacuation, he presumed. Another soft American, wounded by a punji stake or a sniper's round, being whisked away to a clean hospital. They could not even die in the jungle where they fought. The helicopter, a Huey, didn't land. It hovered over the camp's small clearing, and a net filled with supplies was lowered. Then, as the sun began to hint at its arrival, the helicopter banked and disappeared. Truong smiled. It was a confirmation of everything he believed. The Americans could not even resupply their own fortress without a complex, fuel-guzzling machine. They were tethered to a logistical chain 1,000 miles long, a chain that could be and would be cut. What he didn't know, what he could not possibly comprehend from his vantage point on that ridge, was that he was not witnessing weakness. He was witnessing the arrival of the very weapon that would systematically destroy him. It was not the helicopter. It was not the supplies in the net. It was the logic behind them. He was witnessing the first tremors of a logistical earthquake, an industrial logic so vast and so alien that it would ultimately shatter not just his unit, but the very ideological bedrock of his entire cause. The foundation of a North Vietnamese and Viet Cong strategy was a concept known as Dao Tran, or struggle. It was a holistic view of warfare that intertwined political action with military force. General Vo Nguyen Giap, the architect of their military doctrine, was a master of asymmetrical warfare. He had defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu by understanding a fundamental truth. A technologically inferior force could defeat a superior one by controlling the tempo of the war and by making the cost of victory, in both blood and treasure, unacceptably high for the invader. Their entire system was built on the principle of scarcity. Every bullet was precious. Every grain of rice was accounted for. A captured American rifle was a priceless treasure, its ammunition even more so. Their logistical network, the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail, was a triumph of human endurance, a testament to what men and women could achieve with bicycles, ox carts, and their own backs. It was slow, arduous, and vulnerable, but it was born of their reality. It was a system that valued patience, sacrifice, and ideological commitment above all else. Propaganda reinforced this worldview. The American soldier was depicted as a pampered, undisciplined youth lured to Vietnam by money. He was psychologically fragile, unable to cope without his comforts. He was, in essence, a consumer, not a warrior. Their system, built on capitalism and individual gratification, was seen as inherently decadent and weak. It lacked the unifying, strengthening power of revolutionary collectivism. One Vietcong training manual captured in 1967 stated, "The American imperialists have a great many dollars and a great deal of steel, but their spirit is weak. We have little steel, but our spirit is of diamond. We will use our diamond to shatter their steel." This was the core misconception. This was the ideological blind spot that would prove fatal. The Green Berets, the United States Army Special Forces, were sent to Vietnam to fight the enemy on their own terms. They were trained in counterinsurgency, in winning the hearts and minds of the local population. The core of their strategy was the Civilian Irregular Defense Group, or CDG program. They would establish small, fortified camps in remote, enemy-controlled territory, recruiting and training local ethnic minorities, Montagnards, Nungs, Cambodians, to fight the Vietcong. These camps were supposed to be islands of government control, centers for intelligence gathering, and launch pads for offensive operations. But they became something more. They became microcosms of the American system, portals through which the industrial might of the United States could be injected directly into the heart of the jungle. An camp was a fortress, but not in the medieval sense. Its walls were not stone. They were a complex web of interlocking firepower, claymore mines, and listening posts. Its true defense was not its physical structure, but its umbilical cord to the sky. A camp under attack did not need to hold out for a relief column that might take days to arrive. It needed to hold out for a few minutes. Because in minutes, the sky would fill with a level of destructive power the Vietcong could not fathom. The Camp Truong was watching was one of dozens sprinkled along the borders of Laos and Cambodia. It was manned by a single 12-man A-team and several hundred CDG strikers. To the Vietcong, it was a target. To the Americans, it was a node in a vast, interconnected network of overwhelming material superiority. On that morning in 1966, after the Huey had departed, Truong watched two American soldiers emerge to collect the supply net. They untied the cargo, boxes of ammunition, medical supplies, perhaps some mail. Then one of them took the cargo parachute, a large expanse of high-quality nylon silk with its intricate shroud lines, bundled it up, and tossed it onto the burn pile. Truong felt a jolt of genuine confusion. He stared, waiting for someone to correct the mistake. No one did. The parachute, an object of immense value, lay on a heap of trash, destined to be incinerated. In his world, that parachute was a treasure. The silk could be fashioned into dozens of shirts or hammocks. The shroud lines were high-tensile cord, perfect for rigging traps, securing equipment, or 100 other uses. It represented weeks of labor, a resource to be husbanded with extreme care. To simply destroy it was not just wasteful, it was insane. It was an act of economic violence that spoke to a reality he could not process. What kind of system, he wondered, could afford to treat such a valuable object as disposable trash? What level of wealth did it represent? This was the catalyst. This was the first piece of evidence that directly contradicted his entire ideological training. The Americans were not weak because of their wealth. They were powerful because of it. Their ability to waste was a measure of their strength. It was a casual, almost unconscious demonstration of a productive capacity so immense that the very concept of scarcity, the central pillar of his own world, did not seem to apply to them. The initial shock was subtle, a nagging question in the back of his mind. But it was the beginning of a dawning horror that would be echoed by thousands of his comrades as the war progressed. They were not fighting an army. They were fighting a factory. The war in Vietnam was, at its core, a war of logistics. And the numbers told a story of inevitable defeat. They told a story that no amount of revolutionary spirit could rewrite. By 1968, the United States had over 500,000 troops stationed in South Vietnam. For every single one of those soldiers, from the infantryman on patrol to the clerk typing reports in Saigon, the American military logistical system was moving over 100 pounds of supplies per day. 100 pounds per man per day. This figure is almost impossible to comprehend. It included the obvious: food, water, ammunition, but also included an avalanche of other material. It included fuel, millions of gallons of it for the helicopters, the jets, the trucks, the generators. It included construction materials to build entire cities out of the mud, air bases with 10,000-foot runways, deep water ports like the one at Cam Ranh Bay, hundreds of fire bases complete with timbered bunkers, mess halls, and helicopter pads. It included spare parts for every vehicle and every weapon. If a truck broke down, it was not cannibalized for parts as a Vietcong vehicle would be. A new part was flown in, or an entirely new truck was delivered. If a rifle jammed, it was turned in for another. The system valued the soldiers' time more than the cost of the equipment. And it included consumer goods. The post-exchange (PX) system ensured that even at a remote fire base, a soldier could buy cigarettes, candy, cold beer, soft drinks, magazines, and stereo equipment. These were not luxuries. They were considered essential for morale. They were a physical manifestation of the American way of life, transplanted into the jungle. Contrast this with the Vietcong and North Vietnamese Army, NVA. Their logistical system was a marvel of human effort, but it operated on a scale that was tragically outmatched. The average NVA soldier fighting in the South was supported by, at most, 2 pounds of supplies per day. And that was on a good day, when the B-52s had not cratered their section of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The disparity was a staggering 50-1. This was not a gap. It was a chasm. It was a fundamental difference in the very nature of the war being fought. The Americans were fighting an industrial war. The NVA and Vietcong were fighting a revolutionary war. They thought they were in the same conflict, but they were inhabiting different realities. Ammunition expenditure revealed the same story. American commanders, steeped in the doctrine of overwhelming firepower developed in World War II, did not hesitate to use it. A suspected sniper in a tree line would not be stalked by a squad of riflemen. The tree line would be flattened by artillery, mortars, and airstrikes. The concept of reconnaissance by fire meant spraying entire jungle sectors with machine gun fire simply to see if anyone shot back. At the Siege of Khe Sanh in 1968, American B-52s, flying from bases in Thailand and Guam, dropped over 100,000 tons of bombs in 77 days. That is more than the total tonnage dropped on Japan during the final year of World War II. An American infantryman went into the field carrying hundreds of rounds of ammunition, confident that when he ran low, a helicopter would arrive with more. His NVA counterpart carried a fraction of that amount, and every single bullet was a precious commodity carried on the backs of his comrades for hundreds of miles. He had to make every shot count. The American could afford to miss. This profligate use of firepower was not just a military tactic. It was a psychological weapon. It communicated to the enemy that their opponent operated without material constraints. It told them that their lives were worth less than the cost of the bombs being used to extinguish them. It was the logic of the assembly line applied to the battlefield. The symbol of this industrial approach to warfare was the Bell UH, one Iroquois helicopter, the Huey. More than 7,000 of them were deployed to Vietnam. At the peak of the war, Bell Helicopter's factory in Fort Worth, Texas, was producing over 150 Hueys per month. They were being built faster than the NVA could hope to shoot them down. The Huey changed the very geography of the war. It shrunk the jungle. It flattened the mountains. A unit pinned down by enemy fire could be reinforced or extracted in minutes. A wounded soldier, who in any previous war would have died in the jungle, could be on an operating table in a fully equipped hospital within an hour. This medical evacuation system, known as dust off, achieved a staggering success rate. If a soldier reached a hospital, he had a greater than 98% chance of survival. For the Vietcong, seeing a wounded comrade was the beginning of a long, agonizing ordeal. He would have to be carried for days, hoping to reach a hidden jungle hospital with rudimentary supplies and poorly trained staff. Infections were rampant. Mortality rates were horrific. The Americans did not win battles because their soldiers were braver or their tactics were always superior. They won battles because they could bring a localized, temporary version of hell to any coordinate on the map on demand. They could lose a dozen helicopters in a single landing zone, as they did in the Ia Drang Valley, and have them replaced from the logistical pipeline within days. The NVA could not replace a dozen of their seasoned soldiers so easily. The numbers told a story of a war that was already lost, not on the battlefield, but in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, the boardrooms of Detroit, and the computer-driven inventory systems of the Pentagon. The Viet Cong's diamond of revolutionary spirit was being systematically crushed by a mountain of American steel. The macro-level data was overwhelming, but its true impact was felt at the human level, in a series of jarring realizations that chipped away at the ideological certainty of the Viet Cong and NVA soldiers. Consider the experience of Lu Van Ton, a 19-year-old Viet Cong guerrilla captured in the Mekong Delta in 1967. For his entire life, he had known only scarcity. His village shared a single well. Meat was a rare luxury. His world was circumscribed by the rhythm of the rice harvest and the demands of the war. His political officer had taught him that the Americans were decadent and weak, their system corrupt and doomed to collapse. After his capture, he was not tortured. He was not interrogated with brutality. He was taken to a large American base at Kin Tho, and there his worldview was dismantled piece by piece, not by propaganda, but by simple observation. The first thing he saw was a group of American soldiers, stripped to the waist in the sun, laughing as they filled sandbags. Next to them was a large cooler, and they were casually pulling out cans of ice-cold Coca-Cola and drinking them. Ton had never tasted a refrigerated beverage in his life. The sheer energy expenditure required to make ice in the middle of a tropical delta was, to him, a miracle on par with the parting of the seas. He was taken to a processing center. For his first meal, he was given a tray of food from the American mess hall. There was beef, potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, and for dessert, a plastic cup of fruit cocktail. He stared at the fruit cocktail. The vibrant colors of the peaches, pears, and cherries swimming in sweet syrup were utterly alien. He knew what it would take to grow these different fruits, to harvest them, to process them, to put them in a metal can, and to ship them 10,000 miles to this specific place, simply to be eaten as an afterthought to a meal. The logistical chain behind that single cup of fruit was more powerful and more terrifying than any weapon he had ever seen. He saw GIs throwing away half-eaten meals. He saw vast fields of motor pools, filled with hundreds of trucks and jeeps, many of them being repaired by mechanics using complex tools he had never imagined. He heard the constant roar of generators providing electricity 24 hours a day, powering lights, refrigerators, and air conditioners for the American command posts. In a post-war interview, another former VC soldier recounted his moment of realization. He and his unit had overrun a small American outpost. They were ecstatic with their victory. As they scavenged for supplies, they found a crate. Inside, it was filled with dozens of bars of soap, each individually wrapped. He said, "We had not seen soap in our unit for a year. We washed with sand and ashes. To find that the Americans had so much they could give every man his own bar. It was then that I began to worry. How can you defeat an enemy that has so much soap?" It was these seemingly mundane items, a cold drink, a can of fruit, a bar of soap, that revealed the profound strategic truth. A Green Beret medic working in a CDG camp offered another perspective. He treated both his own Montagnard strikers and any local villagers who came for help. He had access to a seemingly endless supply of antibiotics, sterile dressings, surgical equipment, and painkillers. He could treat infections and injuries that would have been a death sentence for the local population. But his true power was the radio. If he had a casualty too severe for him to handle, he could call for a dust-off. He recalled a young Montagnard boy who had fallen from a tree and suffered a compound fracture. The boy was bleeding badly and going into shock. In the local village, he would have died, or at best, lost the leg. The medic put in a call. 15 minutes later, a Huey descended, and the boy was flown to a hospital in Pleiku. He survived, and his leg was saved. The medic knew that his Vietcong counterpart, likely a dedicated and resourceful individual, was operating in a hidden cave with a handful of captured French medical tools, using boiled rags for bandages and hoping his patients didn't die of sepsis. The American medic wasn't necessarily a better doctor. He was simply the endpoint of a superior system, a system that could project advanced medical care into the most remote corners of the world at a moment's notice. This was a form of power the Viet Cong could not counter. They could win skirmishes. They could terrorize villages. They could lay clever ambushes. But they could not compete with a system that treated the life of a single Allied soldier, even an indigenous one, as a resource valuable enough to deploy a multi-million-dollar machine to save. The American engineers, the Army's Corps of Engineers, and the Navy's Seabees provided yet another dimension to this industrial shock and awe. Where the Vietnamese saw impenetrable jungle, the engineers saw a construction site. They arrived with fleets of bulldozers, graders, and rock crushers. They built roads through mountains. They dredged harbors. They laid down entire airfields in a matter of weeks, using interlocking aluminum plates called AM2 matting. A Vietnamese farmer might spend his entire life building and maintaining the dikes for his family's rice paddy. He would watch in disbelief as a team of American engineers, in a single afternoon, accomplished a feat of earth-moving that would have taken his entire village a decade to complete by hand. This wasn't warfare. It was terraforming. It was a demonstration that the very landscape, which the Viet Cong considered their greatest ally, was just another variable that could be tamed and reshaped by American technology and horsepower. Each new road, each new airfield, each new deep-water port was another nail in the coffin of Giap's strategy. They were severing the Viet Cong from their greatest weapon, the wilderness itself. Through these individual, ground-level encounters, the myth of American weakness was exposed as a lie. The soldiers, prisoners, and civilians who witnessed this casual abundance and overwhelming capability did not need to be told about the economic superiority of the United States. They saw it. They tasted it. They felt its power. Their ideology, forged in scarcity and sacrifice, had no defense against the crushing psychological weight of an enemy who could afford to burn their parachutes. The ideological collapse reached its climax in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive in January 1968. On paper, Tet was the masterstroke of General Giap's career, a coordinated, countrywide uprising designed to shatter the South Vietnamese army and trigger a popular revolution. NVA and Viet Cong forces achieved stunning tactical surprise, attacking more than 100 cities and towns simultaneously, including the symbolic heart of American power, the embassy in Saigon. For a few days, it seemed to be working. The images broadcast back to the United States of Viet Cong sappers on the embassy grounds of the ancient city of Hue under siege created a profound political crisis. It shattered the illusion of progress that American leaders had been promoting. In that sense, it was a political victory for Hanoi. But on the ground, in Vietnam, it was a military catastrophe of the highest order. The popular uprising never materialized. The South Vietnamese people did not rise up to welcome their liberators. Instead, the South Vietnamese army, contrary to Hanoi's expectations, fought back with surprising tenacity. And then the American counterattack came. It was not a brilliant feat of maneuver. It was a methodical, industrial-scale application of annihilation. The Viet Cong, by coming out of their jungle sanctuaries and fighting in the open, had made a fatal error. They had exposed themselves to the full, unblinking fury of American firepower. In the cities, they were trapped in buildings and neighborhoods that were systematically pulverized by artillery, gunships, and fighter bombers. In Hue, the beautiful imperial city, entire blocks of ancient architecture were reduced to rubble by air and naval gunfire to root out entrenched NVA soldiers. The numbers were horrific. The Vietcong and NVA lost an estimated 45,000 men killed in the first few weeks of the offensive. The Vietcong infrastructure in the South, built up over a decade of patient, clandestine work, was effectively destroyed. They had wagered everything on a single, decisive roll of the dice, and they had lost. The point of no return was not just the casualty count. It was the realization of how those casualties were inflicted. It was the dawning understanding that there was no defense against an enemy that could call down airstrikes with the ease of ordering a taxi. A captured NVA officer, when interrogated about the fighting in Hue, described the experience. "We would spend all night digging in, creating the perfect defensive position in a block of houses. We were ready for the American infantry. But the infantry never came. First, the planes came. Then the artillery came. Then the tanks came. They destroyed everything. When the infantry finally arrived, there was nothing left for them to do but count our bodies." This was the American system at its most brutally efficient. It substituted firepower for manpower. It was a war waged by logistics officers and air traffic controllers as much as by riflemen. After Tet, the Viet Cong were a spent force. The war, from that point on, will be carried primarily by the regular North Vietnamese army, supplied by China and the Soviet Union. But even with that support, they could never hope to match the American logistical machine. The ultimate concession, the final admission of this systemic defeat, came years after the war was over. In 1995, retired NVA Colonel Nguyen Tho, who had been a senior officer on the general staff during the war, met with his former adversary, retired U.S. Army Colonel Harry Summers, Jr. During their conversation, the NVA colonel made a statement that perfectly captured the North Vietnamese perspective. He said, "You know, you never defeated us on the battlefield." Summers, representing the American view, replied with the devastating truth. "That may be so, but it is also irrelevant." It was irrelevant. The tactical victories and defeats, the ambushes won and the firebases lost, were just noise. The real war was not being fought in the jungles of Vietnam. It was being fought on the factory floors of America. It was a contest between a pre-industrial society fueled by ideology and human endurance, and a post-industrial superpower fueled by hydrocarbons and managed by computers. The greatest weapon in the American arsenal was not the M16 rifle, the B-52 bomber, or the Green Beret. It was the standardized shipping container. It was the computerized inventory system. It was the C-130 transport plane and the staggering productive capacity of the American economy. This was a truth that Giap himself seemed to tacitly acknowledge. While he spoke of spirit and will, his strategy was ultimately one of attrition. He was not trying to defeat the American army in a decisive battle. He was trying to bleed it, to make the cost of the war so high that the American public, the perceived weak link in the system, would lose its will to continue. He was, in effect, attacking the spreadsheet. He was trying to turn the immense cost of the American war machine, its greatest strength, into its greatest weakness. And in the end, on that front, he succeeded. But for the men who fought, for the cadres like Nguyen Van Truong who believed in the power of their diamond-hard spirit, the realization was far more visceral. They had been sent to fight soldiers, but they found themselves locked in a struggle against an entire industrial civilization. It was a battle they could never win. The war in Vietnam is not a story of how a small, agrarian nation defeated a superpower. That is the myth. The reality is far more complex and far more instructive. The United States did not lose the war militarily. It abandoned it. It lost the political will to continue paying the staggering price, in both blood and treasure, that the war demanded. The spreadsheet, in the end, turned against the war planners. But the core thesis, the lesson written in the red earth of 1,000 firebases and the wreckage of 1,000,000 skirmishes, remains. An ideology, no matter how powerful, cannot defeat a logistical system. A revolutionary spirit, no matter how pure, cannot overcome an industrial base. The Vietcong and the North Vietnamese army were not defeated by the American soldier. They were brave, resourceful, and fanatically dedicated. They were masters of their terrain, experts in the art of insurgency. They were defeated by the American farmer, who produced so much food that entire armies could be fed with the surplus. They were defeated by the American factory worker, who churned out helicopters, bullets, and sea rations on a scale that defied imagination. They were defeated by the American engineer, who could build an airfield in a week, and the American logistician, who could supply it from 10,000 miles away. They were defeated by a spreadsheet that calculated fuel consumption in the millions of gallons and a system that considered a parachute to be a disposable piece of packaging. The final, crushing statistics of the war tell the tale. Over the course of the conflict, the United States dropped more than 75 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. This is more than double the total tonnage of bombs dropped by all sides in all theaters of World War II. The American military expended over 15 million tons of ammunition. For every enemy soldier killed, the U.S. military fired, on average, over 26,000 rounds of ammunition. More than 12,000 helicopters were deployed. The quintessential Huey, the UH-1, saw over 7,000 of its numbers serve in the conflict. The factories in Texas were building them faster than they could be destroyed. The financial cost, in the currency of the day, exceeded $168 billion, the equivalent of over $1 trillion today. Each enemy soldier killed cost the American taxpayer an estimated $400,000. These are not the numbers of a war. They're the numbers of an industrial process. It was the application of overwhelming, unconstrained material force. It was a system designed to find the enemy and then bury him under a mountain of high explosives. We return, in the end, to that ridge in the A Shao Valley in 1966, to the Vietcong cadre, Nguyen Van Truong, watching the dawn break over the American camp. He had arrived that night secure in his worldview, confident in the inevitable victory of his cause. He believed in the weakness of his enemy, in the fragility of their decadent, materialist system. And then he saw the parachute. He saw it tossed, without a thought, onto a pile of trash. In that single, casual act of waste, he witnessed a truth more profound than any battlefield victory. He saw a power so vast, so effortless, that it did not even recognize the value of the things it discarded. It was the power of a system that had solved the problem of scarcity, the very problem that defined every moment of his own existence. He watched the smoke begin to rise from the burned pit as the discarded parachute caught fire. The flames consumed the precious silk, the high-tensile cords, melting them down into a foul-smelling slag. And in that moment, the diamond-hard spirit of the revolution felt the first, tiny, terrifying crack. It was not the soldier he feared. It was the factory that armed him.